Again. So when you go to Daniel chapter 12 and you get to verse 11, and it says, from the time the sacrifice is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up will be 1,290 days. That's a 3.5 year period. In the Hebrew calendar year, especially in the biblical times, each calendar month, which was the sort of determination of how they made their years, was a 28 to 30 day period. And they didn't have leap year and the solar calendar mechanisms that we use for a 365 day year and then a leap year every 4 years. So what they did was to offset, to make sure that the calendar and the solar and lunar year, the seasons lined up year after year after year, was that every 3 years or so they would add in, or 3 years or so, they would add in an additional calendar month. And so when you're doing 28-day months and you've got 12 of them in a year, by 3-4 years, you're going to add, you'll add in another month is what they would do. It's called second Adar. That's the name of the month. They would have one first Adar and they would add a second Adar in. So it's kind of like a leap month. And so I think that makes an explanation for why sometimes we have 1,260 or 1,290 days in the book of Revelation. So when we have that 1,290 day period from Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, and we're going to want to eventually look at that and correspond and say, oh, how's that work with regard to the 1,260 days? There's a 30-day difference, and I'll talk about where that 30 days is. I think it's a real difference that exists. So then if we go to Jesus' comments, we'll go to Matthew 24.
Scott?
Yeah.
Did you say that the Hebrew calendar ranges between 28 and 38 days?
I'm sorry, 28 and 30 days, if I misspoke again.
Okay.
Yeah, it depends on, that new moon is the one where there's not much moon there. The moon is empty, and then you get that first sliver of it. So depending on whether the Earth's rotation and seeing that, what the weather was like, was it cloudy, is it at night, it might take 28 days or 29 days or 30 days before they saw the new moon. And then the new month would start. So now over to Jesus' statements about this. In Matthew 24, Jesus says, when you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel stand in the holy place, let whoever reads, let him understand. And then he says, let them that are in Judea flee to the mountains. And then if you keep going here, he starts explaining about their flight to the mountains. And in verse 21, he says, for then will be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. This is going to be an exceptionally difficult period that Jesus places what is properly called the Great Tribulation as occurring after this abomination of desolation, which Daniel puts with a 1,290-day period afterwards. So there's the abomination of desolation. There's a 1,290-day period until Jesus comes back. I'm just going to use that as the sort of end point. And that 1,290-day period is where we find this great tribulation occurring. So in common Christian colloquial language that I grew up with, that the church typically uses, especially in the system of dispensationalism, we typically use the word tribulation in a general sense to mean the entire 7-year period. Even though that most people who believe that will probably have a refined view that says technically the tribulation is only the last 3.5 years. That's the part after the abomination of desolation. And so that's kind of an important piece of the puzzle. If that's where I land, and it helps us to sort of put this together. And so it's with that piece in place, we can start to look at, okay, well, what some of these other events, are they leading up to that abomination? Are they at that abomination, like coinciding with it? Are they just after it? Are they just a series of things that happen during the 3.5 years that follow? Exactly where is that at? But that places this, a particular event is a pretty important key marker for us. And so now we can put some of the other pieces together. I do want to show you guys something I did today. It's just a diagram that you guys hopefully will be able to see it on your screen. It's a timeline of the last 7 years. Now, I just want to warn you, this timeline is not symmetrical. The first 3.5 years is shorter because there's less information about it than the last 3.5 years, according to my understanding. Now, again, I don't mean to say that just showing you this picture makes it true. I just want to give you guys an outline of where I land so that you'll kind of have a picture memory of this if you want, or access to it. I'll send it out when I send out the study notes. But I've got the midway point here over on the left-hand side. It says midway up at the top. And I don't mean, there's some things that happen just to the right of that I do think happen at the midway point, but for visual representation, I didn't want to pile them all right on top of each other. So you got these little arrows pointing to this black line. The black line is sort of the timeline of the 7 years. And so there's some color correspondence. I'm not going to get into spending a whole lot of time on this chart, but I will send it out to you guys so you can kind of see. I've got the abomination of desolation at the midway point. Again, that's not based on the geometry of this diagram. It's based upon the sense of where it is. If you look at the bottom, you can see I've got 3.5 years in the left-hand segment and 3.5 years apportioned for the right-hand segment, which is much larger component of this particular diagram because of the things that happen in it. And so I'll send that out to help kind of explain where at least I come to on this. But let's talk about the plagues. There's a couple of places where plagues are mentioned in Revelation. In chapter 11, we're told about some plagues that the two witnesses administrate. And then in chapter 15 and 16, where we get this vision of 7 angels with bowls of plagues that they pour out. And so we have to ask the question, are these plagues unrelated to each other, so that there's the ones that the two witnesses do are unrelated to the ones of chapter 15 and 16 that the angels are conducting? If they're unrelated to each other, do they take place in completely different portions of time, so that some of them maybe take the two witnesses, maybe they do theirs in the first half, and the ones from the angels in chapter 15 and 16 are in the second half? Or are these two sets of plagues correspondent? That what we see in chapter 15 and 16 is a description of some of the other plagues that the two witnesses will administer during the days of their testimony or prophecy. So those are I think, 2 options about what to do with this. And we can then kind of ask, well, if we separate them, what happens? If we put them together, where do they go, first half or second half? I think if you put them together and you say that the two witnesses are involved in conducting the plagues of chapters 15 and 16, then I think you have to put all of this in the second half, and I'll explain why. And that's where I come down on this. But a couple of things that are important on this. These plagues of chapter 15 and 16 seem to be poured out on the beast's kingdom, and on those who worship the beast, which requires that he's already come out of the pit. He's come into a position of political power in the world, and he's being worshipped by many people around the world. So if whatever we can make this conclusion about the plagues of chapter 15 to 16, they seem to pertain to things that happened in the second half, or at least after the period of time when the beast comes out of the pit. If we have to ask when the beast comes out of the pit in regard to the abomination of desolation, certainly seems to happen before that, but whether it happens right before the abomination or a year or years before the abomination, we'll have to nail that down. But in any case, let's say the beast comes out of the pit very early on in the book of Revelation, or in this final 7-year period, then we could have these chapter 15 and 16 plagues going on the entire 7 years. But if he only comes out of the abyss near the midway point, then these chapter 15 and 16 plagues can only happen in the second half, after that point, after he comes out of the pit and receives power for 42 months. So there's some timeline issues there. So that's where we ask the question, where does the 42 months begin, right? That's when he gets, regardless of when Abaddon comes out of the pit, there's this time factor that says, okay, but he only has power for 42 months. So then we have to ask, okay, is his 42 months at the beginning, first half, or is it in the second half? I think most people put it in the second half. I certainly think it's in the second half. And if that's the case, then again, chapter 15 and 16 plagues are in the second half, after the abomination of desolation. And so if the abomination is at halfway, you can see how these things sort of, the puzzle pieces kind of can only get put together in a certain way once you come to certain deductions about this. And then the only question is, are the plagues that the two witnesses conducted correspondent to the plagues of 15 and 16, or are they completely separate? You know, I'll get into in a further week why I think they're connected, but I'm going to just operate at this point, and you'll see this on the chart that I gave, that the two witnesses are those plagues of chapter 15 to 16, I think are working in coordination with the two witnesses, that the two witnesses and these seven angels are coordinating these plagues upon the beast and his kingdom, which is why I think we have this sort of war between the two witnesses and the beast and his kingdom. He's trying to overcome them. I think they're trying to overcome, they're at least able to prevail against him for a period of time until their death. But then again, we'll have to talk about when their death is, when he kills them. So, all right. Again, let's get into their death. All we know from chapter 11 is that they have a period of 1,260 days of testimony, prophesying, and plagues that they conduct. They conduct the plagues during that 1,260-day period, at the end of which they're killed by the beast. Now, again, we would assume, I think this is the reasonable assumption, that means that right after they're done, not like they're done, they take a 6-month vacation, and then the beast kills them, but he kills them as soon as their testimony is done. And there's a reason that I think that is the case that comes out of chapter 12. So if you go to Revelation chapter 12, obviously follows chapter 11, you get this discussion of the woman introduced and a reference to Christ, who's going to rule the nations with a rod of iron, and the devil and him being cast out. And then as it discusses the devil being cast out in verse 9, 10, 11, it says in verse 9, woe to, you're going to get this statement about what happens when the devil's cast out. And it says, first of all, of him in verse 10, it says, he's the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto death. So when we talk about the beast, when he makes war and overcomes the saints, he's killing them. His prevailing against them, his victory over them, is his ability to put them to death. Here we have this idea that there are some that have the testimony. It's the same Greek family of words. These are testifiers. Now, whether or not this is a larger reference to saints in general in the book of Revelation, whether it's the 144,000 or other groups, or just the two witnesses, these are, whoever it is, verse 11 is talking about, has the testimony, and they are for some time overcoming the devil by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And then it does say, though, that they love not their lives unto death. So there is some indication here that they do die. But for a time, it seems that death, now maybe overcome means they're able to overcome him spiritually, not physically. But there is some kind of tie in here that I think if you're reading through this without other theological experience, which is really difficult for any of us to do, and you were just reading it through as a point of interest, not any stake in the issue, and you were reading through like a book, and you read chapter 11, and you saw that there were two individuals who have a testimony, and then there's this beast that comes against them to overcome them, to make war against them, to overcome them, and to kill them. So they have a period of testimony, and he kills them after that. Implies he can't kill them during that, right? That seems reasonable. And here in chapter 11, we have that there's a group of people that includes those who have the testimony. That's sort of one of the defining elements of this group. They have this testimony, and they're overcoming, and yet they die. So if you put those two together, I think it becomes pretty easy to get to the conclusion that the beast can't kill them during the period of their testimony, but they die afterwards. And so they're overcoming potentially, they're preventing him, they're prevailing, they're stronger than him during the period of their testimony. But again, that gets to some questions about, does the beast kill them? Let's say the beast comes out of the abyss just before the abomination of desolation, or maybe a couple months, or maybe in the year before, I don't know. But then there's the abomination of desolation, and then there's a 42-month period, a 1,260-day period that starts just after the abomination of desolation, in which the beast is given power. And once he has that power, you have to ask, is he going to spend 3.5 years trying to kill the two witnesses, but they're holding him off by the word of their testimony, by the blood of the Lamb, by the fire that they're able to use, until the end of that period in which he is then able to kill them at the very end of the 7 years? Or is the very first thing that the beast does once he receives power for 42 months, in month number 1, to kill these two witnesses who have already been testifying for a period of 1,260 days, and they're finished, and as they finish, sets it up for him to kill them right away? Those are the two options that we have. Either the two witnesses are testifying and prophesying and conducting plagues in the first half of the final 7 years, or in the last half. And so just wanted to lay those options out for you. I think you can probably see from my presentation that I tend to want to put them in the second half. There's a number of connections that make that part of a requirement for me, that they're able to hold him off for that 1,260 day or 42 month period. And then he's trying to do his work in the world, but he's got these guys who are speaking against him, and they're powerful, and he can't overcome them. And it's God's message to the world. And they're conducting plagues, which are tormenting him and his kingdom and his worshipers during that 42-month period. Otherwise, you have the two witnesses conducting plagues in the first half of the month against, I guess, the general population of the world and maybe some other figures, but not specifically against the Antichrist or the beast as an empowered political figure. And then they die, and then he's got free reign, and then God is using these angels, not related to the two witnesses ministry, to pour out now plagues upon the beast and his kingdom during the final 42 months. And so,
God,
yeah, go ahead, Enoch.
While you're on this topic, do you believe that there's maybe a parallel between the two witnesses in their 3.5-year ministry and the enemy or the beast not being able to kill them, similar to Christ, being on the earth and testifying for an odd number of 3.5 years, and it seems like this odd number that he's doing it. There's scriptures that talk about how they could not kill him because it was not yet his time, and obviously there was a set time he had to reach the cross. But at the end of this 3.5 years, and meanwhile he is essentially waging almost spiritual war against these enemies as he's casting out demons, healing people, doing all these things. And the forces of darkness, and then at the very end of the 3.5 years, then he says, "No one takes my life, but I give it up." And then he's killed. I just couldn't help but see the parallel between what you're saying. These two witnesses, they're doing all these things, and 3.5 years, just like Christ, and then they are finished the ministry, and then they die.
Yeah, I think that parallel is very easy to make. I'm not sure that it's something that we can force on people, but I think it occurs to us when we think about what's going on. That God has set certain times and seasons for certain things. Certainly, the work of the two witnesses and their death seems to be part of these designated period of times that God has told us about in advance. And so it makes sense for us to think about it in those same terms, that they did try to kill Jesus during his ministry, but they could not. Now, the two witnesses may avoid that early death by other means. Jesus wasn't calling down fire on people, although there are John and James did ask him about that ability, apparently, or something similar in the gospel. So yeah, I think there's a potential helpful information coming from that. Okay, so we got those pieces on the board. I want to talk about the woman going into the wilderness. We talk about a 42-month period for the Antichrist or the beast. We talked about a 42-month period of trampling the holy city. Talked about a 1,260-day period for the period of testimony, prophecy, and plagues for the two witnesses. And then we have this 1,260-day period for the woman in the wilderness, protected and nourished out there. I will just say that if Jesus is using sort of the abomination of desolation as the onset of the final half, as Daniel seems to indicate, then it seems like all of these, whether Daniel or Revelation is using a time times and half a time, which is to say 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, or 42 days, they all seem to be indicating the exact same period of time, using different things to highlight who's active, right? If it's the Gentile authorities vested in the beast and the Antichrist, it's 42 months. If it's God's work through the two witnesses or with the people in the wilderness, which I think are related, then it's 1,260 days. Again, that's just me doing some reasonable association. Go ahead. Okay. Thought somebody was commenting there. So when we get to Revelation 12 and we see that this woman, right after the devil is cast out, and it says that he comes down to the earth and he's aware, according to verse 12, that he has only a short time. So, what does a short time mean? I mean, like in a historical scope, in the scope of we are getting periods of 42 months and 1,260 days, short time. We got to try to figure out what that means. At the very least, it seems that it means that there is at least one satanic figure. I think it's the devil himself, the top archdevil in heaven still, who does not get cast out, nor many of those who will join him, many of those angels who will join him, until right before this period, when he's cast down and he has a short period of time. And as soon as the first thing he seems to do, at least according to chapter 12, is he begins to go after this woman that's presented. That certainly has some relationship with the people of Israel. I think it may be broader than that, but for now we'll skip that and just look at the chronology. The woman was given the two wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the face of the serpent. Now, earlier in the chapter, we're told that it's 1,260 days. And so I think that, I mentioned this before, there's a reference to Moses and Aaron, the work God did to bring his people out of Egypt under Moses and Aaron, and God describes that as bringing them out on eagle's wings. So the idea of, we look at connecting this woman's flight to the wilderness to Jesus' statement after the abomination of desolation, those that are in Judea must flee to the mountains. There were certainly several mountainous wilderness areas in ancient Judea and Israel as a whole. And so it's easy to think that since the word flight is the same in the Gospels and in John's statement here, that this is a reference to that event after the abomination, where a population that is largely based in Judea or around Jerusalem is leaving that area to avoid the oppression and coming destruction upon the oppressors, right? As Daniel indicates, the destruction upon those who make desolate. They're fleeing from that. Just as the Israelites fled out of Egypt, as Egypt was destroyed by the hand of Moses and Aaron, and just as Lot's family was removed from Sodom and Gomorrah as God prepared to destroy those two cities, they are leaving what will become, or what the Antichrist, the beast, intends to be the seat of his power eventually. God's going to destroy that infiltration into that area and their kingdom that goes with that effort, I think. But if you think about it in these terms, it seems very easy to connect this flight into the wilderness of Jewish people with Jesus' statements and with Moses and Aaron as the precedent. And if so, we have this 30-day gap. The abomination, Daniel says, takes place 1,290 days from the end of the age, or from Christ's return. I'm sort of adding that in. Daniel doesn't state it that way, but from the end. And then in Revelation, there's a 1,260-day period here. I think what happens, I think I articulated this week, is that once the abomination occurs, that's the signal to the Jewish people, as Jesus said, those in Judea, to get out. Get out. There's bad stuff coming. There's going to be a lot of problems, a horrible period of tribulation. And they take about a 30-day period to get out from that area to get situated wherever they're at. And then they spend the remaining 1,260 days, 42 months out in the wilderness. They're out there protected, nourished, as it were, for 42 months, for the entire 42 months. This group seems to be protected from all of the beast's activities through a locational type of protection. He cannot get to them, or at least it appears that he's not able to get to them. And then he seems to turn his direction, his attention and his efforts on others that he can access, or that he thinks he can access. If you read the end of chapter 12, he can't get to those in the wilderness, so he turns his focus to go after the rest of her seed that have the testimony of Jesus Christ and the commandments of God. So he goes back to go after others. So I think that the two witnesses, and again, I know there's some speculation here, but I think that the two witnesses are helping to escort them out there, like Moses and Aaron. They're protecting them, and they get them out there, and then they go back to ministering around the cities of Israel. and then making their way into Jerusalem again. Well, they will finally oppose him and be killed by him at the end of this 1260 day or 42-month period. But again, that would all place these things after the abomination in the second half, with the two witnesses moving around from city to city in Israel. And if you remember, there's a statement that Jesus makes in the Gospels at one of the times where he sends out the apostles 2 by 2, and maybe the occasion where he sends out 72 of them 2 by 2. But that 2 by 2 reference is kind of helpful. And he says, they're going to persecute you. They're going to go after you in the cities, but just keep going from city to city. You won't have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man returns. And if that account is meant, and that statement is meant by Jesus to have some prophetic discussion for the end of the age, then it would make sense that maybe it's referential to these guys who are fulfilling that sort of 2 by 2 role here, whether it's the two witnesses or someone else, but it certainly could be the two witnesses. Maybe I'm asking more questions than I'm answering, but I think that's at least the best way to start our Bible studies, is to get all the questions out before we start making decisions about what we think they are. Let other people process this and kind of come to these conclusions. So we have to ask the question, is the woman's flight into the wilderness after the abomination or before? If we take it in accordance with Jesus' remarks in the Gospels, we have to say it's afterwards. If it's afterwards, then we have to say, is this something the two witnesses are involved in? If they're involved in it, then their ministry seems to be afterwards, potentially. You could say maybe they escort this is not related to the abomination and what Jesus is talking about, and this takes place in the first half, but then you have to ask, what are they not protected in the second half? Maybe not. Maybe they're part of this group that gets martyred. Why protect them in the first half? You just have all kinds of questions that I think start to make things more difficult if you put it there. So let me see. I think I got through most of that. I know it's 8 o'clock. Boy, that interruption really hurt us. Let me see here. I want to mention one other thing. We'll close after this. It may take us a minute or two to get through it, because it'll just help me finish chapter 12 information, and then we'll start up next week with this question of regardless of whether there's a rapture before the final 7 years, there is absolutely a rapture resurrection event at the end of the 7 years. I think most people agree with that. That's not really the question. It's a question of whether there's an earlier event and where that earlier event might be in time in relation to the 7 years. So that'll be where we'll start next week. But I just want to mention something else that's at the tail end of chapter 12, and that is the woman goes out of the wilderness, right? It says in verse 14, we read that. We also read verse 6, I think, last week. And after she goes out into the wilderness, the devil who's been cast out of heaven, he begins to go after her. That seems to be one of his initial things that he's interested in doing. And it says the serpent, so the devil was cast to the earth, and he persecuted the woman. And she goes out to the wilderness for 3.5 years. And it says, the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman. Now, symbol being employed here. Otherwise, you're imagining that there's some kind of dragon that's spewing actual water after this woman to try to destroy her, or this is some kind of flood of something else out of his mouth. And I think, to me, this is easy to think of, and I'll just give a couple of easy references. The idea of a flood of words, right? Like Jesus said, or Paul writes in Ephesians that if you're, well, I'll go to Jesus first. If your foundation is just a sand foundation and it's not on the solid foundation of the rock of God's teaching, the floods will come and they'll wash you away. So the devil comes with false gospel, false preaching, a false message, false religion. He's trying to wash away those who don't have a secure faith here among this group. I think that's one very reasonable way to take this. So he makes this attempt, and it says in verse 16 that the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. So again, this could be a physical catastrophe event, attempt to actually flood them and destroy them, and then the earth swallows up the water so that it can't harm these people. But there's another event in the Exodus, which I think is something that's readily available to consider because of the comparison already, is that when the Israelites are going through the Exodus period, they leave Egypt and they're in the wilderness before they go into their promised inheritance of the land. there's a time when Moses and Aaron are opposed by another group of Levites from under the name of under the leadership of a man named Korah. And in that event, Korah and some of the other leaders of Israel under him and from the tribe of Levi, they come and they're like, look, Moses and Aaron, you guys aren't anybody special. God's no more with you than he is with us. You guys make yourself kind of important. And then there's this sort of confrontation, and Moses and Aaron's like, well, we'll see if God's with us or with all of you guys. Why don't you guys go get your censers, your lanterns? I'm just kind of translating a little bit there, and we'll see whose side God is on. And Moses makes a statement. He says, like, if you guys died the death of normal men over the course of your lives, then okay. But if something happens to you that's very special, then you'll know that God was with us. And what he stipulates is that if the earth opens up and swallows them up, then the people would know that God was really with Moses and Aaron in particular, leading them. And that does happen to these guys. And so it's very similar, the concept that you can imagine false prophets, as the New Testament warns us, you know, they're like the storm coming in with false teaching to try to, as Ephesians says, Paul doesn't want us to be as children, but he wants us to be mature in our faith and our understanding, that we wouldn't be carried about. That's tossed to and fro. It's the idea of being violently dashed by the waves, right? So you think about a flood and being violently dashed about by the waves. And he says, so that we wouldn't be carried about by those who were trying to deceive us. So it's very easy to take Revelation chapter 12 to instead refer to the idea of a group of false teachers that are sent out with the power and authority by the devil, and he's trying to mislead this group as they're going into the wilderness, and they oppose the two witnesses or the leadership that God has there, and that they're swallowed up. They're actually swallowed up, maybe like Korah and his family were, his leadership group was, into the earth, and the rest of the people make it out into the wilderness, and they're not dissuaded by that. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix. It doesn't necessarily help us on the timing element, but I think it's worth noting that that may be happening here. So hopefully I've said enough about this flight into the wilderness and why I think it's in the second half of the year. Certainly if it compares to Sodom and Gomorrah and Egypt, that it immediately precipitates the destruction of the Gentile oppressive nation. Their leaving ends with that event. So you wouldn't imagine maybe that it would be harder to have the woman in the wilderness in the first 42 months to be protected, only to not be protected for the last 42 months, and then to have the destruction come upon the Antichrist. It's much easier to put them protected during the final half of the years. If that's the case, then I think we have to ask whether we're persuaded that the two witnesses are involved in leading them out there. And if they are, then we have to ask how they get them out there if the two witnesses are killed, and what that says about the timing of the two witnesses. To me, it's much easier to say that the two witnesses ministry occurs for 1,260 days, which is correspondent completely to the 1,260 days while the woman is out in the wilderness. They've gotten her out there. They go back to face the beast, and they continue until the end of that time. The woman's been protected. And so I will stop there, realizing I didn't get anywhere near where I hoped to tonight. And that'll give me a chance to stop the recording. We can certainly do prayer requests and continue to converse about this if people want to. But let me just make some notes of where I stopped at and stop the recording.
And we didn't really interrupt you that much either.
No, you certainly could have, but I appreciate I end up losing my train of thought, but it's fine. So